Welcome to the course Algorithmic Design. So optimization and learning. So what is optimization? Again, in this the mathematical principles of computational design, the textbook that is under manuals on my courses, there the optimization is the the book has 5 parts, and then part number 4 is optimization. So it's basically kind of 1/4 of the textbook. If you go there, is basically just this topic, and then the 5th part of the book, which is I guess maybe 1/5 of the other 5th of the book is learning. So in a way, these 2/5 of that textbook are kind of condensed in this one presentation here, which is maybe not that fair, but yeah, that's just how it ended up a little bit in the end. Maybe I should make another course that just deals with these topics on. But basically, when we say optimization, in this context, we mean mathematical optimization. And it's basically, in a way, this is a process where we do a selection of the best element in regard to some criterion. So, and then from a set of available alternatives. Or so in a way, we have a set of possible solutions, and we are choosing the best solution. And here, so that's just a kind of in a very general sense what optimization is. And there's a lot of things here that we assume, or a few things that we assume here. First is here this kind of idea that we can select the best element with regard to some criterion means that we need to be able to choose, need to be able to quantify basically what is good and what is bad. And that's basically then we talk about an objective function, or so there is in a way a function where we put in some parameters and we literally get a number, or it can also be kind of a compilation of numbers, but basically this function just gives us in a way in a quantitative way enables us to assess how good is a certain solution. And then yeah, we have to be able to select from alternatives, or so there are many possible solutions, and they all have different we call it basically fitness, or this term comes from biology. Kind of the organism is fit to survive, so we talk about fitness of the organism. And yeah, in this very general sense, the optimization problems, they arise in basically kind of all quantitative disciplines like mathematics, computer science, engineering, economics, design, and kind of many others. So we talk about kind of a broad class of optimization problems. Now, very important, kind of again, a bit important thing to point out here is that, is what, for example, architects do, is that optimization. That's kind of, that we can discuss. It's not really part of this lecture, but the argument goes that many problems that arise, many other problems that arise then in specifically design cannot really be formalized in the sense that they can then be we cannot apply optimization on them. And they are the so-called sort of wicked problems, so ill-defined problems. And many maybe issues that we deal with in our daily life as designers and architects, they fall under that category. So we cannot really apply optimization on them. And yeah, so that's why that's maybe you could even think of this as somehow a fuzzy boundary line between engineering and design, and why kind of why there is even a split in the disciplines in the first place, because yeah, many problems in design are not really formalizable in that way, and we cannot really apply these optimization procedures on them. Okay, and then the other big topic that we'll look at is learning. And here specifically we mean machine learning. Again, it's a very loaded topic because we talk about learning in the context of psychological development of a human, or child development. But here we specifically mean machine learning. So how do so basically algorithms and statistical models in a computer that basically perform some tasks without using explicit instructions, but basically they can learn from data. So the key thing here is that the machines or computers can kind of learn from data. And yeah, so you would basically have this so-called training data, and then you, based on that training data, you can kind of make some predictions or decisions. And that's what sort of that's what kind of, when you say learning, that's what we mean. If you think a little bit how if you're a professional, you know, how you learn in the first place. You learn by, you know, kind of formalizing the knowledge. So you have textbooks, and you know, you're kind of reading instructions. You're kind of acquiring sort of a knowledge base, but you're also learning by doing, or you're learning by imitating other people. You learn everything like this. Or so if you're an architect, you go to school, you learn from kind of books and so on. But in the end, you also go, you have a design studio, and you kind of apply design, or so you kind of do design, or you're designing, and that way you're applying knowledge, so you're also learning. Plus, you're imitating other designers, you're imitating other architects by looking or analyzing their projects and so on. So you're also, in a way, learning through examples. In a way, you're maybe at the beginning copying, but eventually you're able to extrapolate from these examples. So in that way, kind of machine learning is just a discipline that sort of, in a very precise mathematical way, basically does exactly this. And in a way, this learning is a little bit different than, you know, when we talk about algorithmic design in general, it means that we need to know what the algorithm is. Or so in the, just go to the very beginning, when we talk about algorithmic design, it means that somehow there's implicit algorithm behind that we are manipulating in order to produce something, or produce design, or manipulate design. But in machine learning, this algorithm might be very general, and we might not really know how it works, or because it's basically the knowledge that the algorithm is using is being extracted from the data, from the examples that we give it. That's the idea. So in a way, then again, machine learning is a subset of artificial intelligence, which is a much broader field in computer science. Okay, and then now in this presentation, I wanted to actually spend a little bit even more time on it. I have some other presentations where I deal with these topics, but here I kind of try to condense everything. And I don't think I was very successful, but I'll try. Let me talk about optimization. Again, usually we would use this analogy of a fitness landscape, or it's a bit of a small picture here, but you would have sort of a landscape where you have parameters that are plotted on two axes. In this case, two axes, but you can think of it as a, you know, multi-dimensional space. But if I have two parameters, I can plot them on two axes. And then the fitness of the solution that comes from these two parameters, I can plot as a height of the landscape, or so kind of as a point in height. And if I can interpolate sort of continuously, or between these two parameters, so I can kind of sample every solution by choosing these two parameters at random, or I can sample it from the grid, then I basically get a continuous fitness landscape. And then finding the most optimal solution means finding the highest point in this landscape. And then we can talk about kind of local maxima, so kind of small hills that are kind of locally high, or we can talk about global maxima, so the solutions that are globally optimum, so the best possible solution. And again, if I have only two parameters, you can usually plot this fitness landscape and just kind of literally see which solutions are best. But for multidimensional ones, these fitness landscapes can be very irregular, nonlinear, and it might not be obvious at all, basically, where the highest point is. Yeah, and then again, here on the bottom, you have a famous problem in graph theory called the traveling salesman problem, which is basically, imagine that you're a traveling salesman and you have to visit, let's say, all European capital cities. And because you're maybe selling something, or maybe you're a tourist, you came from USA and you want to visit all European cities. You have to start somewhere. You have to visit every city once, and you want to have the shortest path because you want to be, very efficient in your travel. So what is the most efficient path between all the cities in Europe? You can pose the same question, for example, for USA, if you want to visit all the kind of capitals of all the 50 states. What would be the shortest path? Now, it's clear that there are many possible paths, because I can just kind of, go from London to Berlin to Rome to Prague and so on. So I can kind of shuffle the cities that I visit, and the number of these permutations is very high, but it's finite. That's the important thing. So there's a finite number of solutions, and each of them has a path with a certain length. I can just measure the path. So the question is, so I kind of know that I know that in a finite number of solutions there must be, and they all have kind of paths of different lengths. I know that there must be a shortest path. There might be multiple shortest paths. So there might be more that are the same, and then the question is, are they kind of all equivalent or not? But yeah, and then the question is basically, how do I find it? So there's a whole field of again, engineering dealing with sort of optimizations that is basically dealing with kind of how to find the solutions to these problems. I can, for example, have a similar problem where, for example, I have a boundary area, and I'm looking for a point inside that boundary area, and I'm asking questions, and then I draw a line and I say, is the point in left of the line, or left from the line, or right from the line? And then based on that, I can kind of draw this sort of decision graph. This is actually called here. It's a kind of binary space partitioning tree. Or and then if I tell you, well, the solution is in B, or the point that you're looking for is in B area, great. I can kind of go on, and I can subdivide B further, or so I don't worry about the half where I was told that the point is not in. And if you remember, there's a I forgot the name of the game, but the game where you're kind of trying to guess who you are, and then you're asking first, am I a human, or am I, kind of an animal? And then you're basically asking yes or no questions, and you're getting one of the two answers, and you're basically always kind of partitioning your space. Or so, am I human? Yes, no. If no, then okay, I'm not human. I kind of go on. So basically, I'm kind of looking for a solution. I'm only allowed to ask yes or no questions. So in a way, every time I get an answer, I'm sort of, from all the possible solutions, I'm partitioning it in two sections. And then of course, in that game, if you know the best way to win, or to have the least number of steps, is usually that you ask the most broad questions. So it will take very long if I'm asking, for example, I'm trying to guess if I'm a person, then I'm asking, am I Brad Pitt? No. Am I Angelina Jolie? No. So it might take very long if I'm asking very specific questions, but if I ask very broad questions like, am I a male person? Yes or no. Am I an old person? Yes or no, and so on. So by asking broad questions, I can actually arrive to the solution quicker. Okay, so that's kind of one type of problems where you're sort of always partitioning the solution space in this sense. Another way of looking for problems, or this is already kind of going into learning from data, or so I have a number of points. This is actually called a linear regression. It's using this, so here on the bottom right, it's using the least square solver. So I have some number of data points. They can be, for example, heights in a population, some other, just any kind of statistical information that I can sort of gather. And then I'm trying to, in a way, fit a line through all of these points, assuming that the underlying model is linear. So there's basically a way to get this line, so the best fitting line that goes through all the points. And this line is basically now my predictive function, or now I can sort of predict, if I kind of choose a number here on the X, I can get kind of a number on the Y, and I'll be sort of very close to where all the statistical samples falls. Right? Basically, with the linear regression, I can create a predictive model. Of course, here you have to do many assumptions, like you have to assume that the underlying model is linear. It can also be nonlinear, so you can have a kind of a parabola and so on. So again, in machine learning, this is some of the things that we would do. We would represent our information as data points, and then we would kind of try to find a model that best approximates these data points, so we could kind of extrapolate from data. Okay, so optimization also appears, there's a kind of specific part of optimization called instructional engineering called topological optimization or topology optimization. It's basically a way to, if you have a structure that has defined anchor points and loads, we can sort of find basically where the material needs to be arranged, kind of placed in order to get the most efficient structure. This means that we are basically putting the material there where it's needed, and we are removing it from the places where it's not needed. We can do this in a sort of iterative way, and we can sort of find the most like structurally efficient solution. And then we can have many different constraints. For example, here on the bottom, you can see an example of if I have a kind of a full beam and I have some holes that need to be retained. Maybe there are kind of ventilation ducts or some kind of a utility holes, so something needs to go through them. And the condition is basically the truss needs to basically have holes in this place, so the material is not allowed to pass through these holes. They need to be free. And then I'm basically removing the material around the holes and finding the, in a way, the truss structure that is trying to minimize the material used while still retaining the structural capacity. And these models, they always kind of revert to spatial frames, kind of gives us a clue that somehow the, you know, using lattices is a very efficient way to kind of carry loads. That's why they are kind of used a lot in construction. And yeah, these topics are not really new. So this is from Viollet-Ledoux from the 19th century, kind of something a little bit similar, kind of liking the, you know, bone system or bone joint to sort of a mechanical joint. And the kind of asking questions, sort of, you know, what is the difference? Why did the nature choose this shape, and why are we kind of choosing these shapes here? So as to do sort of with the way we are producing things, we are crafting things. And there's a whole field of digital fabrication where these questions are kind of very, very important. Also, we are talking about kind of, if you're producing something, how much material we're using, what is the load bearing capacity, and basically, you know, can we learn from nature? Or is the, because it turns out that if you look deep enough, you'll realize that nature is not really, or nature is kind of usually using a very efficient solution to kind of construct things. So it's also kind of evolutionary, or evolution is already is a type of an optimization, which we'll get to that in this slide. So yeah, one big kind of class of optimization algorithms are evolutionary algorithms. Or so, again, you could have a course just on these. Basically, you are sort of, you're kind of taking cues or sort of formalizing the process of evolution in a computer to basically find the best solution. So this is one example. This is this kind of a simple genetic algorithm. This means that if you have a design, we kind of distinguish between sort of a genotype of the design and the phenotype of the design. So again, the terms that I'm using here are taken directly from biology, because these algorithms are just inspired by processes in biology, so specifically in biological evolution. So if we find a way to kind of describe a phenotype, meaning sort of an expression or kind of our design through some code, or so this would be kind of a genotype, that would be the code, chromosome, and the design would be sort of the expression of that code. Then this model basically represents sort of a solution space, and the genotype, or this code that we encode information in, is the so-called search space. Or so we have a mapping from a search space onto the solution space. So we can go from a genotype or a chromosome of a design into the kind of actual expression of the design. So it can be a 3D model or biological organism or another computer program or whatever we want. So we can have, and then by basically having different genomes, we can sort of have a sort of a population of design. So we are kind of talking about population, or yeah, kind of a collection of genomes that gives us population of different designs. And then on these genomes, we can perform optimization directly using genetic algorithms. So we can use, again, algorithms that are directly inspired by biological evolution. So this is the so-called crossover. It happens during sexual reproduction, for example. The merging of chromosomes of two parents is basically that, as far as I understood. And then there's also a genetic operator called mutation. So we are kind of performing sort of like a random mutation on the genome, which is also happening in biological evolution as well. It's actually very, very important operator. So that's kind of how diversity is introduced in a population. So kind of random mutations. And then the third component, so we have these genetic operators, and then we have very important part is the actual selection. Also, we need to somehow perform a selection. In nature, this is happening due to limited resources. So organisms fight for food, and the ones that get the food survive. The ones that don't get the food, they don't survive. And of course, the situation is a bit more complicated. We actually, the ones that manage to reproduce survive onward or are able to pass on their genes, and the ones that don't manage to reproduce, they are kind of a dead, evolutionary dead end. So in that sense, we talk about fitness of an organism. So how likely it is to be able to pass its genes onward. But basically, we're talking of a very general process of selection. And we can talk also about just kind of a simple tournament. We have a population of, for example, 100 solutions, and we're just choosing the 50% of the best ones. They are the ones that pass on. Again, in nature, this happens in cycles. You have kind of offspring, and then winter comes, and some of the offspring dies, and in the kind of spring, this offspring is now young cubs that are able to kind of survive on their own and so on. So there's a selection that happens during the year at different kind of rate, and in a computer we can sort of artificially sort of simulate it. And here this is an example of genetic kind of programming, or so we can sort of think of our designs as sort of graphs of sort of operations. So you can think about grasshopper script is basically a graph, like non-cyclic graph. And then when we talk about these genetic operators like mutation and crossover, we talk about kind of operations on that graph. Or so there's a kind of a lot of so this whole field of evolution, this kind of evolutionary optimization, basically got inspired again by biological evolution. Okay, and then so if you go again into the textbook, the Mathematical Principles of Computational Design, there you will see a lot more written on that topic. And this is also nothing. So these topics are nothing really new. These examples, some of these examples are like super old. So we're talking about since 60s or 70s already. So very, very kind of old example. This is in a sense a very old topic, even in the field of sort of design. This is what I promised, I think maybe last time, that I will kind of explain a little bit more on the wave function collapse algorithm, which is a basically type of a learning algorithm. So we can sort of use sort of seeds, so example patterns, and we can then use the algorithm to basically create sort of to kind of extend or extrapolate that pattern further. And today this is maybe used a lot in game design for procedural generation of models. This is the actual algorithm here that I found kind of one diagram of. And yeah, the main point is that you have some input, then you basically create tiles of that input. So you're discretizing the input. And I mean, if you have a 2D image, this is rather easy. You're creating sort of tiles, and then you're trying to map the probability that certain tiles are adjacent to each other. So you're creating adjacency rules which are probabilistic. That's why these are called probabilistic machine learning models. And yeah, then you can kind of use these probabilities to kind of continue tiling on, or so you can kind of add tiles, and usually, yeah, so kind of you're going from the possible set of all possible solutions on a kind of to a sort of a specific solution. That's why it's called sort of a wave function collapse algorithm, or it's again inspired by the wave function from I guess the Schrödinger's equation from physics. Again, if this is a bit too abstract, if you ever played the game Carcassonne, exactly the same thing. Also in the game Carcassonne, you have sort of tiles that have some adjacency rules, so they have to kind of fit together when you put them. And basically players draw these tiles randomly, and they're trying to put them into the big picture. And when you complete a feature, you get some points. Or so you're basically doing kind of applying the algorithm as you're playing the game. Of course, you're not constrained to a rectangular sort of grid, or you're in a rectangular grid, but your final layout will most certainly not look like this, but it will kind of sort of grow organically on the table. And it's a very fun game. You can also play it with kids. Okay, and then these probabilistic machine learning models, they are, that's again kind of a whole class of them. And so they're so-called sort of Markovian design machines. And one example of them is this so-called Boltzmann machine. So they're basically some kind of neural networks, or and this is one example that I found where these machines, these codes, they can sort of learn a sequence. So you can kind of teach them how a certain sequence looks like, or certain image looks like, and then this machine or this code is basically able to reconstruct the sequence from partial information. Or so you give it kind of partial information, and you can sort of the machines can sort of reconstruct the sequence. They can do this because they kind of learned how which pixels have to be adjacent to which pixel, which patterns have to appear in the picture. So it's very similar to this, how this algorithm, wave function collapse algorithm works. So in a kind of a probabilistic way. And again, not to make it too abstract, but at the end I will give you a reading. One of the texts that I gave you is this one here from Immanuel Koch, discrete sampling. And these are just some examples from him. So he's an architect. I think he was before in EPFL in Lausanne, and now he's in Singapore. And yeah, he's just an architect who is basically applying exactly this this algorithm or these principles in the field of design. This is actually a discretization of Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona pavilion. Or these are kind of the tiles here on the right, and this is the actual pavilion. You can kind of in the text that I give you, you can find it in the text section. You can actually read it from one of the architectural design magazines, one article, and he did the same thing, sort of discretization of this Stan Allen's field condition kind of diagrams. Okay, so these, I mean, basically everything that I'm also showing you in kind of all the lectures, but also this lecture here, this has already been applied to some design problems. And even though I'm not always giving you all the examples, you can be sure that everything that I'm showing you has been applied again in the design field by someone. You just have to, it's literally just the one Google away. Okay, one other very popular neural model. Again, neural models are kind of used for machine learning, so for learning, are the so-called Kohonen networks or self-organizing maps. So I think his full name is Teuvo Kohonen. He was or is a professor at Helsinki University. So and yeah, it's basically a neural network that can sort of recognize patterns in data, and sort of you can use it to organize data, or so you can kind of organize in sense images by basically in that sense, kind of images that are similar to each other according to some criterion, they would be grouped close to each other. Or I'll show you later, there's a link here on the website from Mira Roman. Is a PhD, he's a doctor now from ETH Zurich, and his doctorate, as well as kind of all the work that he's doing, is employing these kind of self-organizing maps. And Yeah, we'll go actually on his website. I'll show you some of the examples. He's a very good reference. Or basically how these models can be applied in design. And he's an architect, you know, he's doing architectural competitions and so on. So kind of fully in the field. Another example. So these are examples from me. I think I maybe showed them already last week. Variational autoencoders are another type of neural networks that can be used for learning. So specifically learning to kind of so-called variationally autoencode either images or in this case geometry, so lattices. And you can also go on Google Scholar and find this paper. I think it's free to download from online, and you can kind of go a bit more into technical details. But the idea is that you have a data set which is composed of three-dimensional geometry like lattices, and you through a variational autoencoder you can sort of learn sort of the defining features of that data set, and then you can use this the decoder of the network as a kind of a as a generative network. So you can sample from that latent space, and you can basically create hybrids of the training set. So this is one example of kind of going from one model, which is this kind of castle, to the CCT tower here. So you can kind of have a continuous interpolation or hybridization between these models. And again, we are not really telling the network how to kind of do this, but we are just feeding it examples and then sort of sampling from the sort of the learned parameters. But I want to show you a little bit more about what can be done in the field of sort of say machine learning and kind of creative machine learning. So there's a project that we did with a group that I'm part of called 10 Studio. So we did this project last year called Machine in the Garden. Or so kind of the idea is that you can use this big gun deep neural model. So that's the kind of big generative adversarial network, which is again not done by us, but it's I think it's done by Google DeepMind, not sure. So we just kind of use their model, and this model is trained on I think around 1,000 different categories of images, and these images are actually pulled from ImageNet, which is a large online repository of tagged image data. And basically for each of the categories, so each the image category, these guys kind of created they create like a generative adversarial network that is then able to generate sort of fake instances of these examples. And then because they did it for these 1,000 categories, you can actually create a blend between the categories, or because you can sort of can map it onto the same latency. You can you can sort of perform a training on the same latent space, and then basically kind of do this kind of merging. Okay, so it's basically kind of what I showed you at the beginning, merging between different lattices, but here it's merging between images. Or so in that sense, this is, for example, volcano and saxophone, and you can get different outcomes. Now, these are just snapshots, or so depending on the parameters that you choose. So basically, if you define a blend between a category, for example, volcano and a saxophone, you have a large space where you can sample from, and yeah, then these are just some results of that sampling. And yeah, these are kind of, they look very good because these images are, I think, 512 times 512 pixels. So they're not really high res, but you know, that's already a kind of a decent image size, and these resolutions are kind of getting higher and higher every day. Because I think these models were trained already a few years ago. Okay, so these are basically image hybrids between different categories, and in this project, Machine in the Garden, we were looking into kind of hybridizing sort of, you know, nature, environment, and sort of technological and artificial, so kind of man-made environment. So kind of natural environment and man-made environment, and kind of taking these categories and sort of merging them together, and then basically sampling that space and finding, let's say, interesting outcomes. So it's a very serendipitous approach to design, where you have this in a way, kind of a search space, and you're kind of moving through it and finding interesting outcomes. Also, these are all very weird, kind of weird, yeah, kind of hybrids, but also quite, some of them are quite realistic, like drilling platform, cache machine hybrids, and these more architectural ones. Okay, and as I mentioned, you're basically sampling the space, or which is continuous. That means that if you sample in a very continuous way, or in small distances, you can actually create, you can get very smooth transitions. Or so this is an example of that, but unfortunately very low res. But that's kind of still the ongoing research. Kind of theory, we can get these in the same resolution that the images that you saw before, except that this GIF, which is done with a very low res. Okay, so, and yeah, when we talk about sort of hybridizing between different categories, that means, you know, we can kind of move in a continuous way from one category to the other one. Here on the left is the megalith, and on the right is oscilloscope. And again, then we can move through that space as well. Or so it's not a two-dimensional space; it's a highly dimensional space, or high dimensional space, and then we just sample. We sample these different kind of parts, and we can create animations. And these you probably saw already online. If you kind of put in, you know, gun, you know, outcomes or gun generation, you will see tons and tons of these. So there are also a lot of kind of artists and designers these days that work with these tools because they're kind of quite powerful. Two texts to read. These are, well, obviously now also the last text that I will give you. Even though again on our My Courses page there's a lot more, so there's a whole set of them. One of them is this discrete sampling. So from Immanuel Koch, it's actually rather new, 2019. It's from one of the AD issues, and he's an architect or designer who's using this, again, wave function collapse algorithm to do designs. And he finished a PhD at EPFL. I think his PhD thesis was on that topic as well. And yeah, so it's a rather short article, kind of a lot of images. You can kind of just go through it. I would recommend it. And then another one, which is a little bit off the topic, but off the topic for this input, but definitely in the topic for the whole course. And I just forgot to give you before, so I decided to include it now. It's from Ludger Hoverstad. So it's called A Fantastic Genealogy of the Printable. It's a very nice article about basically a relationship between sort of a printing industry, printing press, kind of some ideas coming from all the way from Renaissance and Enlightenment period and into the kind of digital age. So kind of the ideas that, you know, some ideas that relate sort of, you know, microchips, ideas that the way we produce microchips is basically that this technology is, it's actually printing technology, it's technology used in printing presses, or that's how we produce chips. They're basically printed. So this kind of whole idea that these microchips are, you know, they're kind of printed, but they also operate through code. So in a way, they are in a way some physical manifestations of code. So there's kind of operational codes, and then drawing parallels basically there. I think that gives a very nice kind of maybe a whole kind of wrap to the whole course, kind of relation between the code, materiality, and then kind of, again, some of these sort of ideas that stem all the way from Enlightenment period. Ludger Hoverstad actually has a very large group at ETH Zurich, where that basically does like tons of research in this field. So there are definitely kind of publications from them are always worth to read.